What's up, y'all? Happy Sunday night. It's your host, Wes Soller for The Breaking Conservative, and one of our main shows here, Refounding Fathers. Always happy to be joined by Kyle Walton, my libertarian buddy. How are you, bud?
All right, man. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, man. And then Christopher
Great.
Souza, my liberal friend. Good to see you, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good, man. So I talked about liberals for like 2 hours today. I got to be on another guy's show, and we talked about you a lot. Not you specifically, but you
I will
liberals
have
a
to
lot.
listen.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. But we talked about paradigms. We talked about how liberals and conservatives and libertarians just approach everything differently, like just different assumptions, different premises. As they go into debates, they think about things in a completely different standpoint, and how that's why so many debates just don't make it anywhere. Because if you don't get to that premise of like, why does someone see the world the way they do, then you're just going to talk past them. So it was fun. It was a lot of fun. But I love this show. I love a chance to get to talk to you guys. You know, one of the things that I believe is that we have to get out. We need to get out more. We have to get out and to talk to people of different perspectives and political beliefs and understand them and where they're coming from. And then at the same time, they need to understand us better. So this is the show where we get to do that. For the topic tonight, I felt like it was important. We talked about this last time, but there's been so much of the liberal versus conservative, dynamic going on in the election. But even before that, it just felt like the entire world was divided into these two camps. And Kyle was lonely over there, just watching all the battles take place.
So sad.
And like, and then we don't get to take any shots at you. The Libertarian Party it felt like it was non-existent in the election, to be honest,
Dude,
Kyle.
don't worry about it. We've been taking shots at ourselves really forever. We're worse on ourselves than anyone.
It felt like, was it Justin Amash was like the only one that was like serious in terms of like having any type of chance for real big political support, and then when he dropped out there was like nothing. And then libertarianism, it just felt like as a belief system, people are just not talking about it, because I mean, in the age of COVID, when we have like trillions of dollars being spent on relief, and both parties or have done it, so it's not like I've seen conservatives trying to say, hey, this is not a good use of resources. But I mean, let's be honest, like how like we'd be doing the exact same thing
Yep.
if Trump was in power right now. So, it's interesting to me to bring the libertarian perspective back in, especially now,
Yeah,
when
absolutely.
conservatism is going through kind of like a re-examining of itself. So that's what we get to discuss tonight. Any thoughts on that before we kick it off, Chris? Because it's about to be Kyle's show.
Oh yeah, I'm a fan of Justin Amash. I think that he's got a lot of great ideas and is a very principled person, and one of the few congressmen who refuses to put power above his principles. So that's something I really respect about him as a libertarian. I think the Cato Institute does a lot of great work. From more of a left libertarian perspective, the organization Center for a Stateless Society is super fascinating to me. I've read their book Markets Not Capitalism, which is almost to the point of being more like left anarchist than libertarian, although they do identify as libertarians. I didn't necessarily find it fully persuasive, partially because like a lot of the time I wonder like, okay, so they want kind of the abolition of the state, but what exactly is going to replace that?
Yeah.
But I did find their analysis of certain problems caused by government to be very persuasive. And I found their just complete principled drive and ideological consistency very appealing to me in an era where ideological consistency is not necessarily a hallmark of either party.
Yeah, it's like Jon Stewart. I think he had Ron Paul on his show years ago, and he was like, "You seem to have principled ideological consistency. Americans don't really go for that, right?" Like, and it's that part of libertarianism. I think a lot of people understand, but it's this notion of, is it actually practical, that I look forward to getting to and kind of dissecting that. But we do have to have at least a definition of what libertarianism is, because so especially with conservatives, because there's so many times where conservatives seem to define themselves as libertarians as if there's no real difference. So I thought that'd be a great place to start, and that's kind of was the challenge for Kyle, is like, defend yourself. What is it that you actually believe? So
Sure.
take it away, Kyle. We want to hear it.
Sure. Yeah. So when we think about libertarianism, it's really just a collection of a set of ideas, right? And like Christopher said, there's a lot of people who might identify them, with the idea of libertarianism. And what that means, on the left, you have people like Tulsi Gabbard, who has a lot of libertarian tendencies. On the right, you have people like Thomas Massey, Rand Paul, a lot of Kentucky guys, for some reason, really libertarian. And then also, people like Justin Amash, who is now an independent.
Right.
And so really, more than a political party, I think libertarianism represents itself as a set of ideas. In fact, I would say that those ideas were one of the two most practiced ideologies at the founding of our nation. Liberty. You can go actually hit the slide. Head over to this next slide for us. So the idea of liberty, or what libertarianism, it comes from the root word libertas, which just means liberty or freedom. It's the same root word that you get liberas, which is a libera, which is the same idea of liberal. And so actually classical liberalism is a strain of libertarianism. So if you think about libertarianism as kind of a big umbrella, there are a lot of different groups within libertarianism. On one side, you might have conservative leaning libertarians like a Thomas Massey or like a Rand Paul, or more like Rand Paul, I guess. And then you'd have more kind of independently minded folks like your typical Libertarian Party. And then even you'd have people on an even more extreme side, like anarcho-capitalists or ANCAPs, or anarcho-communists, ANCOMs. And those are probably likely the book that Christopher was reading was from one of those groups, probably. So, but when we think about what libertarianism is, a simple definition is there at the bottom of the screen. A libertarian is one who advocates maximizing individual liberty while minimizing the role of the state. And so we kind of think about those two ideas in tension with each other. The more that the state takes on a bigger role in the individual's life, or the life of the society or culture, community, whatever, the less individual liberty, less community liberty that people have. So those ideas are constantly in tension.
Yeah. I guess one of my questions is, you mentioned,
go ahead.
the founding fathers as being libertarianism or classical liberal.
Yeah.
Which founding father would you say was the most libertarian in their beliefs and what they wrote?
Well, I think Thomas Jefferson definitely comes to mind. Thomas Jefferson, Sam Adams, James Madison are kind of the three big ones, but there were a lot of kind of lesser known guys out there that you can definitely find quotes from. But this idea that liberty, or that individual freedom, is the most important thing, and that the idea that the power of the state needs to be kept in limit or in control, that's a really big idea for these founding fathers. Go ahead.
What about like Alexander Hamilton, right? You see him as a libertarian? Because I can't even imagine.
Not at all. No, of course not. No, he would be. Well, no, right? Because I think that you would probably claim as a conservative, right? Because he,
maybe.
Yeah, he held on to traditions that even wanted to call the president Your Majesty, if I recall.
Sure.
Guy was a big fan of tradition and an institution. So definitely wouldn't claim. And central banking, by the way. Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, he believed in these big government institutions, especially financial institutions, and definitely butted heads with Thomas Jefferson a lot on the power of the federal government versus the state governments, especially. So yeah, Hamilton was absolutely not a libertarian.
Right. Yeah, I can't even imagine. There's several other founders that I would have a real difficult time, and even Jefferson himself he spoke about a minimalist state. He talked in support of certain limitations on government, but he was also the type of person that was like, yeah, we could throw out the Constitution every 20 years. It's really not that great. He's also the guy who did the Louisiana Purchase. There's nothing small government about the Louisiana Purchase.
Sure, but ideologically, if you think about the people that he was most influenced by, someone say like John Locke, for example, or Hobbes or Thomas Paine, those guys were kind of fundamental in what we call classical liberalism today.
Fair enough.
Yeah, my take anyway. So libertarianism, we kind of break it down. There are, I guess, 4 kind of key components, and a lot of these are kind of playing in and with each other. And the first key belief is the idea of natural rights. And you can switch over to the next slide here for us. So the idea of natural rights. So this is the idea that specific rights, specifically the ideas of rights of life, liberty, and property, pre-exist government. These are things that are evident either in nature or are believed to be endowed by a creator. That's how our Declaration says it. But the idea that these rights pre-exist government, and therefore government has no right to infringe on these rights or to limit the rights of these ideas for the people. So specifically, that would include the ideas of life, liberty, and private property. The non-aggression principle, or the NAP, this is a really big distinguishing idea for libertarians today, specifically the Libertarian Party, is the non-aggression principle. And that's basically just says that any idea that you have, if it requires force, is a bad idea, and we're not going to do it. So if you have to have your ideas backed by aggression, backed by threat of violence, then that is an unjust policy or an immoral policy, right? And we can kind of look to even ideas like thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal. Those are kind of the foundational principles for that. And if you can't do that as an individual, then the state also has no right to do that thing. So, for example, libertarians might think that might understand that taxation itself would violate the non-aggression principle. Taxation, you could argue, is the duty of citizens, but when it's backed by the threat of violence from the state or the threat of aggression, then you're crossing a line as to what is good for a government to do. Kind of underneath that is voluntarism, and this is really playing off the non-aggression principle. But voluntarism is the idea that all interactions should be voluntary, right? The state shouldn't force or coerce interactions between individuals, businesses, or anything like that. And then, of course, libertarians love a free market. We believe, generally speaking, that free markets will sort out just about every problem that we have. And that any issue that we have is typically a result from government interference in those markets. So if we want to kind of sum up, you can go to that last slide. If we want to kind of sum up libertarianism in an idea, it's this quote from David Boaz. It says this: libertarianism is the view that each person has the right to live his life in any way that he chooses, so long as he respects the equal rights of others. Libertarians defend each person's right to life, liberty, and property, rights that people have naturally before governments are created. So kind of appealing to that idea of natural rights again. In the libertarian view, all human relationships should be voluntary. The only actions that should be forbidden by law are those that involve the initiation of force against those who have not themselves used force actions like murder, rape, robbery, kidnapping, and fraud. So that would be a general working definition of libertarianism for us. Again, libertarianism is a broad umbrella, and you're going to find a lot of varied positions. We're not a monolith, just like conservatives are not a monolith, just like people on the left, not a monolith. We have a wide range of opinions within us, but those are kind of a general idea or overview of what libertarianism is.
What are your thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, I think that libertarianism has a lot of great things to say about freedom and rights, and the idea that like the state should stay out of people's way as long as you are not necessarily harming others. I think what liberals tend to think that libertarianism misses is that, yeah, liberals definitely think that the state can be an agent of, violence, an oppressive agent in people's lives. But we also believe that the state can do a monumental amount of good when it is put toward good ends and conducted in an ethical way. And so, we also have a slightly different conception of freedom. There are liberals who say, people have the right to healthcare or the right to a home, the right to a decent wage, the right to even be able to take care of your family without necessarily being forced to work, which is where the universal basic income kind of comes in. I don't necessarily like to frame things in that manner, because I think once we start talking about things as abstract as rights, you get into this whole conversation about positive rights versus negative rights, and it becomes very confusing and it's very easy to talk past each other. But I do think it's hard to argue with the fact that, when people have a decent wage or when they have health insurance, they are more free than people who don't have those things. They are able to go about their lives in a way that people who don't have those things are not able to do. So I think that is the aspect of freedom that I most struggle with when it comes to libertarianism. Because as I said before, like I find the ideological consistency of many libertarians very appealing. But if the question is, does libertarianism work? I think absolutely it works in certain areas and doesn't work so well in others, especially when it comes to financial issues and issues regarding the welfare state.
I think what I really keyed on is the notion of or the definition of freedom. Is that people are more or less free based upon what they possess. That seems to be in conflict with John Locke. I don't know. You tell me, Kyle. You know him better than I do.
Well, I wouldn't say that libertarian was defined, or that people are more or less free by virtue of what they have. It's that people are born free and free to work for or earn any possessions that they have. So, yeah, I don't necessarily think that's what Locke is saying in terms of at least how libertarians would be viewing that.
Yeah, I mean, so this notion of rights, I think, is as you said, is at the center of libertarianism,
Yeah.
and that is something that to me I've always struggled to understand. Is we talk like Jefferson talks about rights being self-evident, but are they?
Yeah.
Are they? I mean, it's this convenient phraseology that, well, they're self-evident to us, but there was immediately debate and discussion, and I think a big reason that he opposed the Constitution was because so many rights were spelled out in the Bill of Rights, and the Anti-Federalists didn't like that. Immediately, there was debate
Yeah.
over what a right is. And to me, it's this notion that people have value in themselves, but the way Chris is talking, a right could be perceived as something totally different in that it's what the state owes you or the market owes you. And so immediately we're in a completely different conception of one of the most fundamental tenets that you're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. So for me, where I see the idea of natural rights is in Scripture, right? So I'm a Christian, so I kind of base my worldview on what the Bible says, and there's this idea in the Bible of the Imago Dei, that people are born in the image of God, created in the image of God,
Okay.
and that for me is the most fundamental, most transformational idea in the history of the world. That idea alone imbues every single individual on the planet with inherent dignity, inherent value, inherent worth. And so rights for me as a libertarian are coming out of the idea of the Imago Dei, that everyone is born inherently with rights, specifically the right to life. That's why abortion is a really big thing for me, and why I also believe it should be the key issue for libertarians. If we believe that the right to life is a fundamental natural right, then that should be an issue we're talking about. But also the idea of liberty, in other words, of free will or free expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of choice. That a government, a king, can't tell you what you have to believe in your heart, then that's another thing. And then also, of course, the idea of natural or property rights, that
Yeah.
what I have is mine. The government has no right to it. You have no right to it. What I have is mine. And those are things that the government should be inherent in protecting. You're right. I think Chris hit on a really good point, that there is definitely a trend for everyone, and this is true of both people on the right and the left, saying everything that I want is a right and everything I don't like is up for debate, and that's a problem. So of course we need to define more clearly what rights are and aren't. But
Well,
go
and
ahead.
then the notion that you talked about in that man's value leads to rights. I wanted to read Jeremiah 10. It says, "I know, Lord, that a man's life is not his own. It is not for
Yeah.
man to direct his steps." Right? The notion of rights being supported by the Bible to me is very problematic because, I mean, immediately they're violated. People have a right
Sure.
to life. Yeah, how long did that last? I mean, just keep reading in Genesis, and immediately those rights, if they exist, are violated between Cain and Abel, by God
Sure.
Himself, right? And then by Israel. The entire book of
Mm.
Judges, the book of Joshua, you see all of these times where in Scripture, rights to life, liberty, and property are continually being violated, and God isn't asking for people to be free. He's asking for them to follow Him. So to me,
Mm.
I've never understood how you could reconcile the scriptural narrative with a notion of rights. I mean, Locke himself in his first treatise writes out any type of relationship between God and man. And then by the second treatise, because there is no relationship, hey, people are free to do their own thing. So help me, because I think we all agree on the value of human beings. I don't want to speak for Chris, but most liberals I know are quick to say there's value in human beings, but does that translate into a telos and an end in which human beings are rewarded with freedom in almost every aspect of life? I don't follow
And
that.
can I say as well, liberals absolutely definitely agree that every human being deserves to be treated with dignity. But I think we also feel like the free market often does not treat people with dignity. It is often a very cold, dog eat dog, chaotic place. And as someone who grew up in poverty, I feel like but I was not treated with dignity fully by, and I'm not necessarily opposed to capitalism as an idea. But I think without a welfare state, without the state stepping in and, yes, taxing people in order to fund the system that we need, I think that really does interfere with the idea of people being treated with dignity.
What do you think, Kyle? So you got two. You got two. Now you got both of us on you. What do you think?
Yeah. Hit me with one question at a time there, and I'll respond to it.
Okay, so start with the scripture.
Sure. So, I don't want to get too much into the theology of things, but where Christ is, there is freedom. That is a pretty foundational New Testament belief, right? That where Christ is, there's freedom. And so if you are a person made then in the image of Christ, redeemed by Christ, and of course, this is, again, I don't want to get too much into the theology here. But where Christ is, there's freedom. Would be my simple response to that. If we're a nation that wants to submit ourselves, even tangentially to a Christo worldview, then I think that freedom is an important part of that. Chris, what was your question?
I didn't have so much a question as an observation, but just the idea of every individual being having dignity. I do think that translates to the idea that we do need some kind of social welfare. I guess if I were to phrase this as a question and get more on target of the theological aspects, I'm not a theologian, but I do know many Christian liberals who feel that they are inspired by Christ to fight for stronger social welfare programs and for aid to the homeless and refugees and those suffering. I think I know what the libertarian counter argument to that is, but what would you as a libertarian say to that argument that a Christ-like government
Sure.
would be a government that does more to help the poor rather than relying on the free market?
Cool. All right. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I would argue that if you go back to the Old Testament, right? So you have like God's law. God's law is divided into three parts called the tripart division of the law. It's a theological term. But basically the law given by God to the people is divided into three parts. One of those things is God's moral law, right? God's moral law is something that never changes. That Christians today are still bound by God's moral law. Another part of the the tripart division is national law or civil law for the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. And finally, the third part of the law is religious law, Jewish ceremonial law. So today, I would argue that we are only under the moral law of God. Is it going to kind of tie back into Wes's answer here? So in the Old Testament, when you see a lot of those things happening that you're talking about, people's rights being violated, things like that, that is specifically, what's the right way to phrase this? That is for a specific purpose at a specific time, given by a certain person for certain circumstances. I know that's kind of a lot of caveats, but it is what it is. Right. In the New Testament, when you talk about what Jesus is maybe calling people to do, I would argue that Jesus is calling individuals to those things, right? Jesus is never calling for governments to feed the poor. Jesus is never calling for governments to do those things. He's calling for individuals to do those things. and understanding that there is a division between the individual and the state, I guess would be my short answer for you.
Interesting. So there's a lot here. I'm excited, man, because there's so
Yeah.
many different questions here that we've already brought up. And we started with what is libertarianism, right? And now look what we've already gotten into.
We're in the Bible now, baby. Yeah.
Yeah, the notion of does it work? The notion of what does freedom
Mm.
actually mean? The notion, is it scriptural, right? Like is it the obvious or
Mm.
evident belief for Christians? So there's so many things to explore, and that's what's amazing to me is we were talking at the beginning about how there's this debate between right and left, and there's this debate between conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, Trump versus Biden. We're leaving out all of this. We're leaving out all of this. So, I enjoy it to be able to flesh out some of these ideas. I think we're going to have to do this over multiple episodes. We've had several
Yeah.
comments here. I want to go through them really quickly because I don't want to end the show without that. But we're going to have more shows on this. So if you've got more comments, send them to us so that we can feed them into a few more shows because I think we can stick on this for.
These are good comments. I'm just now reading them. Yeah, I love them.
Yeah. So Megan had several. She said that communism and socialism can also be good in theory, but they don't work with consideration of human nature, in her opinion. So, I mean, that's a great question right there. Is libertarianism just good in theory, and does it not apply to human nature? Yes or no? So that's something that we're gonna have to look into.
Yeah,
And
let's
then
talk about
Kyle, have fun trying to defend that. I don't know.
it.
And
Will
then
do.
Lena just posted. She's always posted amazing comments. So we'll
Mm.
have to get to that one. I'm so sorry, Lena, because we're about to hit our time limit on here, but we'll definitely get to your comment on our next show. We are going to go into conservatism on tap, our next one. But thank you, Kyle. Thanks for sitting here in the gauntlet between the two
Yeah,
of us. You did great. We'll have some more. So if you got more questions for Kyle, you got more questions for us, we're going to do that on our next show. Thank you guys for coming and enjoying this. Don't forget that Refounding Fathers, we've got more episodes on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you can message any one of us, and we'll be happy to include it on the show. So you guys have a great rest of the night, great week, and I'll see you this time next Sunday.
You as well.